My name is Roger Hupe, and I was born on July 25th, 1948, in Greenville, Ohio, at Wayne Memorial Hospital. To my knowledge, there is no story behind my name. Mom just had this habit of she'd be reading a magazine or something, she'd see a name and she'd like it, and that's what you became. It's like my sister Sandy, she saw Sandra in a magazine, and so Sandra, which now is Sandy, became Sandra. And I think that's where my name came from. It's not one you bump into all the time, that's for sure. We lived in Versailles, which is about, I think, 18 miles away from Greenville. Greenville is the county seat of Darke County, and Versailles is noted for its excellent football teams in Ohio. In '58, my dad lost the job that he had and had an opportunity to go to another place up in West Unity, Ohio, which is in northwest Ohio, to be a manager of an egg processing plant. He was in poultry and eggs all of his life. And the job he had before he went into the Army back in Versailles was in eggs, and then he moved over to a company that dressed chickens, called Poultry Producers, and then he left there and went back to the egg business, Weaver Brothers, which actually delivers here in Fort Wayne. And that all fell apart, and when he went to look for a job, he was offered a job to manage a plant in West Unity. And so we, in 1958, and I believe it was October, we picked up lock, stock, and barrel, loaded it all in a semi, and moved to West Unity, Ohio. And I thought that we were on the dark side of the moon because it was such a dinky little cow town. There were only about 900 people in the whole town. The biggest industry were feed mills, and it was just so backward. I mean, Versailles was no metropolis, but it was about 2,000 people. So we moved into this small town that was about half that size. And in fact, what was even more strange, even though I was a kid, is Versailles had a bar about every other door, and every Friday night and Saturday night there was always a fight down there, you know. West Unity was a dry township, so there wasn't a bar anyplace. Now people drank like fish, but they didn't want to have the bars, so there were no bars in West Unity. So it was a real, we had to really adapt when we moved up there. West Unity, I mean, to be honest with you, I developed friendships, and obviously that's where I was for most of my school days. But I was considered Versailles to be more of a home in that whole area of the country, because that's where all the family was, that's where the cousins were, that's where the grandmas and grandpas, and all of our roots were back there in Versailles and Greenville and Covington and Dayton and that whole general area. And when we moved, and it was only 120 miles away or something like that, it was like we lost contact with all those people. And it was a big part of our life. We were very close to our cousins and things, and that all came apart. So you're kind of thrust into a situation where you're not a native, you weren't born and raised in this town, so you're always a little bit of an outsider. You know, even we had a class reunion not long ago, and they talked about, you know, first grade, second grade, that sort of thing. I didn't live there then. I was still in Versailles, so I don't have any memories with them at that time. So you're always kind of an outsider when you get transplanted like that as a kid. It was even harder with my oldest brother because he was a freshman in high school. And so to have to leave his high school and go to West Unity, Hilltop High School they called it, was pretty traumatic for him. His name was Edward Eugene, but he always went by Gene. He went by his middle name. He was named after two uncles. My mother had a brother, Werner, and his middle name was Edward. And my dad had a brother, Franklin, and his middle name was Eugene. And so when Gene came along, the first, then he was Edward Eugene, but he didn't like Edward. He didn't want to be called Eddie, so he went by Gene, okay? And frankly, he beat the snot out of me pretty much my whole life. He was not nice to me at all. I mean, I loved the guy, I was upset, obviously, when we lost him, but I could never do anything right. I was always fat and sloppy and ill-mannered, and, just he didn't care for me until we got a little older, and then we could have a few beers together and have some laughs, and then everything was fine. But growing up, I mean, it was miserable. And in fact, a little scenario, he would beat on me. He always would stick his knuckle out and hit me in the arm, which just hurt like crazy. And what he didn't notice is I grew up. Okay, I wasn't this little fat kid anymore. I was suddenly, 6+ feet tall, and I had slimmed down, and I was pretty muscular. I was running a paper route. I was riding 7 miles a day just on my paper route. And so he started getting on my case. This was on a Saturday, I believe. And we had some words, and he socked me, and I threw a roundhouse punch at him and left. And when I got back, half hour or so later, his girlfriend, who was going to nursing school, was taping him up like he had a cracked rib. Well, the truth be known, what had happened is I bruised his spleen, and he was bleeding internally and ended up in the hospital. So he beat on me all those years. I throw one punch, and he ends up in the hospital. And there's just no justice here. After all that beating I took, one time he threw a ball bat at me, hit me in the ankle, and I limped around for 6 months. And I hit him one time, and he ends up in the hospital. And then we had no health insurance back then. And my mother insisted that I felt so guilty about the situation that I wanted to pay the hospital bill. Well, the truth be known, I was the only one that had money in the bank. And this was back when the hospital bill for a week in the hospital was under $400. So it was not bad. And I had the money in the bank, so essentially I thought I was loaning the money to bail him out of the hospital. But no, I felt so guilty. I did not feel guilty at all. He had it coming. But that's okay. I mean, it is what it is. We had a close family. My dad was the oldest of the 2 boys. And his mom, who was an absolute saint, her name was Elizabeth, and she was a shilling and married Carl Hupe. And Carl was a bit of a scoundrel, and Carl would chase women like it was going out of style. And ultimately, they ended up getting divorced. And this was at a time when a divorcee was an inferior person. It was the woman's fault that the divorce didn't work. So she always felt, or that the marriage didn't work. So she always felt pretty inferior as a result of that. And she was the sweetest lady in the world. And my dad, I mean, he played sports. He was in football. And this was at a time in Versailles. They actually built a football field out of an old gravel pit. And so there wasn't a lot of grass in there in the early days of the football field. So, I mean, literally falling down would just tear you up. And they didn't have any money. So in order to have football shoes, he actually pounded nails through the bottom of some work shoes to make spikes so that he had football shoes. And my grandfather was, at least according to my dad, was pretty cruel to him. He was extremely unreasonable and blamed my father for a lot of things. And one time my dad was changing his clothes in the after basketball practice and took his shirt off. And the coach saw that he had been beaten with a belt and had welts on his back and wanted to call the police on my grandfather. And my dad didn't want him to do that. But ultimately, Grandma and Grandpa got divorced. I could never figure it out as a kid because we'd go to Grandma's house at Christmas time, and then Grandpa would show up. And it's like, okay, who's that guy belong to? I didn't understand what the situation was. But he still had a relationship with the family even though they were divorced. And he ran a grocery store in Greenville, Ohio called the Golden Rule Market. And it was just this crummy grocery store kind of in this neighborhood. And he always, his signs, his advertisements for his specials, he would write on meat paper, these big sheets of white meat paper. So you couldn't even see in the store because it was all covered with meat paper on the front of the store. So you know, it was cut. But he was a grocer all of his life. In fact, he had a grocery in Dayton, and he had an instance there where he got robbed. He actually shot the robber, killed him right there in the grocery store. But then they moved to Versailles. Well, he moved to Greenville. And then Grandma moved to Versailles, and they actually had a restaurant in Versailles that she ran, and Dad helped her in the restaurant. And Grandma was, she cooked at the local hotel, which wasn't much of a hotel, but she was the cook there. She made the best fried chicken, and she had this spice cake that was to die for, and she was just, every time you went to Grandma's for a dinner, it was like she cooked for the Army. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was all good stuff. Really great. I miss her like crazy. But anyway, we were all close. You know, the relatives were close. Dad was close with his cousins and so on. And like I said before, you know, in Versailles, we lived at 307 Virginia Street, which was kind of on the edge of town. The house was extremely old, but Dad, it was constantly a project of remodeling. It had the weakest floors. I can remember walking through, it was a one-story house, walking through there and the floors would bounce almost like a trampoline. In fact, Mom had a piano that she sold when we moved out of Versailles, and they were afraid that the piano would end up in the basement when they rolled it across the floor because the floor was so weak. Dad built a garage out back, and when we first lived there was just an old shed back there. And Dad tore the shed down with the help of some of the neighbor kids, and in fact, part of the shed fell on me when I was just a little kid. But I always loved hammers and pounding stuff and everything else. And so I was out there with the big kids, and it had these big wooden beams that were the gable end of the shed. Well, they broke it loose, and they were just going to let it drop. Well, I was standing too close, so I started running, and I didn't run fast enough, and that thing flattened me right there. And there was actually a spike sticking out that went into my back, but fortunately not far enough to really cause any injury. Tore my shirt. But I think I bit my tongue. Dad took me in, put me on the couch, rest a little bit, back at it. I mean, you know, you didn't go to the doctor unless you were dying, so apparently they didn't think I was going to die. But anyway, built a new garage back there then. They poured the floor themselves, and it was a little roly-poly. It wasn't quite level. But then Dad, rather than gaining a garage, started a bicycle shop in that garage, Hupe's Bicycle Shop. Stuck a sign out front, and he'd come home from work, and he'd work most ungodly hours in the poultry business. He worked for a company, I think at that time, called McKinley Produce, which was in Piqua, Ohio. And he'd come home from work, and the first thing he did was go out in the shop and fix bikes all evening, and then turn around, go to bed, and go back to work. I mean, he worked constantly. Mom was a little complicated. She was the sweetest person and a really good mom. Dad was never around. I mean, she raised us kids. She's the one that had to make all the decisions and take care of things. And it wasn't that Dad didn't want to be around. He just constantly worked. I mean, he'd go to work at 4 o'clock in the morning, come home at 8 o'clock at night. And like I say, then he had the bike shop. But there were times, I know when we were kids, I mean, some funny things. You know, life insurance guys back then were what we used to call debit life guys, okay? And you'd spend a dime or a quarter a week on life insurance. And they'd come around and pick up the money and give you a coupon for the premium. I mean, that's the way it worked. Well, my mom, and it's interesting me being in the insurance business, but she hated insurance guys. And I can remember as a kid hiding in the bedroom, There was the front door that came into the dining room, and then there was the living room, and then their bedroom. And so the policy man had come knock on the door, and we'd all have to scatter and go in the bedroom because Mom didn't have any money to pay the debit life guy. And there were times when she'd actually go through old purses just to try to find enough money to buy a loaf of bread. So, you know, we didn't have a whole lot, but she always made do, and we never went hungry, so pretty special. But she was a hard person, I guess, for a lot of people to get to know. She was very opinionated, very, very good heart, very sweet lady. And sometimes, I mean, when she'd talk about her cousins and her family, you know, her eyes would light up. That was very pleasant for her. That was something that was very important. She always taught Sunday school, very devout, you know, and it was very important to her. She was a diehard Lutheran. It was very important to her that all of us grew up and stayed in the Lutheran church, and that was just the way it was going to be. And I remember they had an old German Lutheran church in Willowdale, Ohio, which is where we went to church, and that was about 7 miles away from Versailles, but that was Mom's home church, was St. Paul's in Willowdale. And Willowdale's claim to fame is that's where Annie Oakley was born, in Willowdale, Ohio. Kid you not, true story. She's buried, I think, in Brock, which is not too far away. It's near Versailles. But she's from Darke County. And so anyway, they had this old Lutheran, German Lutheran church is what it was. They used to have the services in German. And my Uncle Will used to play the organ, and the organ hung on the wall. It was a big old pipe organ. And I can still see Uncle Will up there just tickling the keys. I mean, he's sitting up about 3 feet up off the ground, you know, playing that pipe organ until hell wouldn't have it. But they built a new church next door. And when they did that, then they put in all these candlesticks and stuff. And she always thought that looked like that was Catholic, and that just had no business in a Lutheran church. That's the way Mom was. But, you know, she's a sweet person, very caring person, and loved her to pieces. One of her favorite Bible verses was the one about Naomi and Ruth, you know, whither thou goest, I will go. It was cool. We lost her in 96. So, lost her in 96, my oldest brother in 97, and Dad in 98. So, we kind of got to the point where we go to the funeral director and just kind of do the usual, you know, because we did the same casket. I think we changed the colors, but we did pretty much the same service for each of them. But yeah, it was a pretty tough time. But in any event, you know, Mom was a hard worker. She always had a kind of an inferiority complex because she always had a tendency. Her mom was short and stout, okay? Typical old German gal. Mom was extremely close to her mother, but she was built a lot like her mother too. And back in the day, I mean, when I was a kid back in Versailles, the things we did, people would just have a fit over now. I mean, we'd throw rocks, not stones, rocks. You know, we'd take sticks and whack at each other. I mean, it was tough. And these little kids across the road would come and make fun of my mom, call her fatso and everything else. They'd stand outside the house and do that. And it just hurt her so badly. Now, ultimately, she ended up losing weight, and she kept it off, and she was pretty happy about it. But it gave her that inferior feeling, you know, that she wasn't as good as everybody else. And I think that's sometimes why she was a bit opinionated and a little bit hard to get to know. But sweet lady. Yeah, I was in the high school band. I tried to play the trumpet. My dad played the trumpet. In fact, when he was in the service, he was actually in a band that played dances. And so I wanted to play the trumpet. We actually had 2 of them, so that was perfect. You know, I didn't have to rent an instrument or buy an instrument. I could just play the trumpet. Well, the problem is I got this huge overbite. And of course, that was in a day when you didn't go to orthodontist or any of that stuff. I mean, what you had is what you had. So the band director approached me because I was getting nowhere with this trumpet. And part of it was I wasn't practicing like I should. And so he came to me and he says, look, we're going to lose our sousaphone player. And I was a big guy. So he says, I want you to try the sousaphone. I think you'd be better at that. And so it was going to be good for both of us. So the only thing I had to buy was a mouthpiece, and they had the sousaphone. I had to pay rent on it, but it didn't amount to hill of beans. And so I played sousaphone for 5 years in the marching band. And that thing just weighed a ton. And I tell you, you carry it on your shoulder, and it was just a killer after you got done with a parade or something. It was tough to carry that thing around. We had a lot of good friends in the band. We had some good times, went to band camp each year, had some fun. And we did all kinds of parades. We did, every year we'd do the Christmas parade in Toledo, which was kind of fun. And we did, we'd parade over here. We did one Auburn, Harlan days. We used to come and parade there. Of course, Jubilee parade in Bryan. The fair was always a big deal. So yeah, we got around. It was fun. Marilyn had a crush on Ron Clark, who was a good friend of mine in high school. And Ron was friends with her, thought a lot of her because she was a lot of fun. And so he told me, I didn't even have my driver's license yet, but Ron was a year or so older than I was. So he had this old Pontiac that he'd drive around. So we went for a cruise one evening. He says, you got to meet Moby. That was her nickname, Moby. And so we pulled up the library, and I got to meet Moby, and that was the first time I ever saw her, was there. And we really, during high school, there was no romantic interest between the two of us. She was a friend, and hung out a lot together. I actually dated one of her best friends for a couple of years, but I went to college. She went over here to International. We kind of lost touch with each other. There was a weekend when she and some of the other girls from Bryan went to Ohio State for the weekend to visit some friends down there. And I actually, because I had a car at school, it wasn't much of a car, but I had a car. And I actually took her, I came over to Fort Wayne and picked her up and took her so she could make that trip. And I can't remember, I don't think I took her all the way down there. I took her to meet somebody else. And that was the first time I had seen her since high school. I graduated in '66, she graduated in '67. And so we kind of lost touch with each other. I dated a couple of different people. I had a fairly serious relationship in college with a gal from Detroit. We broke up after I graduated. I was working in Dearborn for SS Kresge's, which was the forerunner to Kmart Corporation. And I was home for a weekend. I think I had drill because I was in the National Guard, not the National Guard, but the Reserves, Army Reserves. And so I think I had a drill that weekend. I was home, and they're at Mom and Dad's, and I get this call. And I didn't know who it was. It said, what are you doing? And I said, nothing. And I said, I'm home for the weekend from Dearborn. Well, you don't know who this is. No, I don't know who this is. Well, turn your front light on and we'll be over in a few minutes. So she came over with Ron, and I couldn't believe the metamorphosis that had taken place. It was just like I was smitten with her right away. She had matured a great deal, okay? She seemed a little, I don't know, not irresponsible, but a little immature, okay, in high school. It's not that I was the most mature guy in the world, but, she was always messing around with her friends. They'd go out TPing houses and soaping windows and all this kind of crazy stuff. And after we both went through these experiences that we had, she was a different person. I was a different person. So it was funny because I went to see her then the next day, and, well, it wasn't the next day, it was Sunday, I guess. And Ron showed up too. So Ron shows up, I show up. Her dad got a big tickle out of that. But then she and I started to date, and the rest is history. So we started to date in 70, and then I went away for active duty in the end of 70, November of 70. I reported to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for active duty for my training for the reserves. And then I got out of there in April, early April, and came back, and then went back to work. And then she and I saw each other fairly regularly, although my job then with Kresge's wasn't in Dearborn, it was in Mount Vernon, Ohio, which is down by Columbus. So she's in Fort Wayne, she's working for IPFW, has a great job, better job than I had. And I'm working in Mount Vernon, Ohio, so it's like a 3-hour drive, 3-hour plus. But I'd come over here as often as I could to see her and come home on weekends, usually the weekends when I would have drill for the reserves, then, you know, I got the whole weekend. Otherwise, I'd have to work at the store at least one day. And it was just like we dated, we loved each other, we needed each other. This piecemeal relationship we had just wasn't working for either one of us. So anyway, as it all turned out, in 72, we just kind of made up our minds that this was crazy, and I would ask for a transfer, and we were going to get married. So that was in January, and February 12th, we got married. We got married on Saturday. Monday, I get a call. I got to go back to work because I've been transferred to Fort Wayne, Kmart North. So we packed up together and went back down to Mount Vernon, and I worked the week while my boss took off, and then came up and all worked out. It was just the right thing. We were meant for each other, and I mean, you know, it's been 46 years, and you know, it's a great marriage, and I still love her. Back then, if you went to college, then you would get a student deferment. You would be classified, I think it was 2S. Okay, as soon as you graduated, or if you went on probation or you flunked out, you would be immediately reclassified to A1, which was, or 1A, which was you're ready to go to the draft. And I was one of those lucky little guys that was in on the first lottery, because old Nixon, in his infinite wisdom, was trying to get us out of the Vietnam War. And so as an alternative to the draft, he instituted a lottery, and that was in December of '69. So I was one of those people that was subject to the lottery. So it was a matter of when your birthday was as to what number you had, and went all the way up to 365. Now, as hot as the war was at that time, most people thought they're going to take them all anyway. But no, in order to make this justifiable, he said they wouldn't go beyond, I was 100 or 150 or something like that. Well, good old me, I got 67, so I was on my way as soon as I graduated from college. So the day after the lottery, because I had borrowed my way through college, I was in debt. The way my luck ran sometimes, I figured I'd end up in some rice paddy someplace dead. So whether it was right, wrong, or indifferent, a friend of mine suggested to go to Bryan the next day and enlist in the reserves, Army Reserve. I didn't even know the unit existed there. And he said, no, go down there and get your name on the list. He said, they'll probably take you before you get drafted. And so that's what I did. So I went down there. This was, again, December of '69, and in March, I think it was March 11th of '70, I was sworn in to the Army Reserve. And I spent 6 years in the Army Reserve. Back then, the reserves were just that, reserves. And we would do our 2 weeks of active duty each year for training. And we were actually a construction unit. Okay, so we built stuff. And in fact, in Williams County, we built a park which was fairly adjacent to the our facility there. We built an airport over at Montpelier. It doesn't exist anymore, but we built an airport over at Montpelier. We built, there's a place called Auglaize Village over by Defiance, which is a historic area. We did a lot of work on Auglaize Village. We built a shooting range for the sheriff's department, all sorts of different things. When we would go on summer camp, when we go to summer camp, we'd build stuff at these various outposts. So like there was Camp Pickett in Virginia that we went to. What we did is we repaired and tore down various barracks that were either in disrepair, needed to be repaired, or not salvageable when they had to be torn down. We built a handball court for the generals down there. AP Hill was probably one of the worst places we went because there weren't any fixed structures other than for the supply office. So everything was tents, but they built roads there. They worked on roads in that facility. We went to Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, and we also went to Fort Knox, Kentucky during my little tour of duty in the reserves. I ended up to be a Staff Sergeant E6, which was good. I was the supply sergeant, actually. It wasn't a bad gig. But it turned out okay. I mean, sometimes I always felt like a second-class citizen because I didn't go to Vietnam. No, I didn't go to Vietnam. I served during the Vietnam War. There was a chance we could have gotten called up, especially during the later years, because they went to an all-volunteer army. So now the reserves were more in the center of things. When they did strength calculations, the reserves weighed pretty heavy on that. And in fact, they changed our mission from a construction engineer outfit to combat engineer heavy. Now, a combat engineer is different than a construction engineer because combat engineers are the guys that are crawling up there, blowing bridges and trying to make way for, through the barbed wire for the troops. And they're on the front edge of things. So we were getting missiles and tank retrievers and all sorts of stuff. And we were spending a lot of our time in the field training. So the mission was changing, but unfortunately, you always kind of felt like you're a semi-draft dodger because you went to reserves. Well, I spent 6 years and I sacrificed a lot to do that, and I didn't run from it. I did my job. In fact, we were doing a thing for Toys for Tots out at Walmart a while back, and the guy came up and thanked me for my service, and that's the first time anybody ever did that. Now, it's happened since then, but that was the first time anybody had ever thanked me for being in the reserves. Well, of course, when we first got married, we were living in this mobile home up on North Clinton. It was a great place to start, but we had an opportunity. I knew I was going to get transferred with Kresge's. And I liked Fort Wayne. I liked where we were in Fort Wayne. I liked the town. And we were only an hour or less away from parents and family. So I started looking for another opportunity. And we were transferring our insurance. I was with Nationwide Insurance over in Ohio. And we were transferring our insurance to Indiana. And the guy came out and talked to me and said that they were hiring. And I thought, well, might be an opportunity. So I went out and talked to the guy and went through several tests. And it was a process. I think I started the process in like October and finally was hired and went away to school in March. It took that long. I had to get my licenses and all that sort of thing. But it was a chance for me to be able to stay put. Insurance is exactly opposite of what I was doing because in insurance you can't move. Once you've built your business, it is where it is. Whereas with retail, they would move you around all over the place. So we switched that, and then we had an opportunity to buy our first house, which was out on Roseberry Drive. One of the adjusters for Nationwide was selling it himself. Got a heck of a deal. Best deal I ever had on a house. And the only house I really ever made any money on. And so we bought that in '74. And sold our mobile home to another one of the adjusters from Nationwide. And that got pulled over to near Mount Vernon, Ohio, where I had worked with Kresge's. It was kind of funny, Knox County. But anyway, We weren't sure we wanted kids. It was a matter of trying to just get things moving. And so, I mean, money was tight. Her job, she was making more than I was making even after I changed jobs. But after we bought the house, things started to go okay. And then I left Nationwide after about 18 months and went into the independent agency system with a family agency here in town, and was there for 7 years, and then started this agency in '81. But the whole time, I mean, we decided, when we did decide to have kids, which was 5 years after we got married, roughly, she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, and I agreed. So I was losing half my income or better, but we made it work. Yeah, we have a monkey piggy bank that I bought when I was with Kresge's, and Marilyn named it George. And so George, and we still have George someplace, but we would put our loose change in George. Well, if we wanted to go out to dinner, we had to raid George and take all those coins out because we didn't have the extra money to go out to dinner. So that was a big deal if we went out to dinner. Matt was born in '77. We started Hupe Insurance in '81. Oh, it was funny. We didn't really know whether we wanted kids or not. So we decided, okay, we want kids. Bam! The first night that we really tried to conceive, she gets pregnant. Okay, bam! So there's Matt. I think for everybody with their first one, it's a learning experience. You know, there's no manual with the kids. Matt was a good baby, but he wasn't the easiest baby in the world. He would go through these, what they call PM fussies, where 5 o'clock in the afternoon, for no good reason, he'd just start yelling his head off and cry and cry and cry and cry. He was dry, he was fed, everything was fine. He'd just cry. And Marilyn finally figured out that if she went outside and just didn't listen to him, that sooner or later he'd quit. And like it took a day and he quit. But I was very proud. I was ready to bust when my son was born. You know, I loved him to pieces. Cutest little scutter in the world, curly hair. Well, yes, we wanted a second one. You know, we thought it was perfect to have a boy and a girl, so we wanted a girl. And we tried and tried and tried, and she just could not get pregnant. And then ultimately in 1980, Kirsten was born. And she was kind of a heartbreaker because she had jaundice. And so Marilyn hung around the hospital some extra days. The doctor was able to make that work, thinking that she would come home, and she was under that bilirubin light, and it was so sad. And she didn't get to come home. She ended up spending an extra day after Marilyn came home, and we went back up and fed her. And then she had strabismus, and she ended up with a couple of surgeries to try to correct her cross-eyed condition. So she was kind of a heartbreaker. Always felt like I needed to protect her a little bit. And then, yeah. And then Courtney was a surprise. We didn't plan to have a third child. You know, we thought we were done. And it was our 10th anniversary, and we had a good time. Marilyn suddenly finds out that she's pregnant, and she was just fit to be tied. So Courtney was a surprise. Now, Marilyn warmed up to it, obviously. Everything was fine, but yeah, she was a total surprise. So, but yeah, it gives you a whole different perspective on life when you have kids. All three of them are totally different. I mean, growing up in the same house, they're totally different. Matt is extremely independent. He doesn't like to show his hand very well as far as emotions are concerned. He doesn't do that. He's kind of a no bullshit person. You know, he doesn't, well, we talked about these trips that we win. He doesn't really want anything to do with those because he doesn't want to go with a bunch of people he doesn't necessarily know. He wants to go with the people he wants to go with, okay? That's just Matt. It's just black and white. That's the way it is. Kirsten has always been the more warm-hearted, compassionate. She's deeply religious, and I don't know if that's the correct term, but she's a very spiritual person. It's very important to her, which I really like. And she makes sure that her kids get the proper training and have a proper perspective. night and day from Matt, for example. I mean, and they don't get along all that well sometimes just because they are so opposite. They're so different. They love each other, but they're different people. She always talks about, and you don't like to hear this when you're a parent, and you never hear it when it happens, but Matt would take her and stick her. We had a big chest freezer at home. He'd shove her in the freezer and sit on top of it. One time, I don't know if it was her or Courtney, we had this foyer in the house that we had over in Manners of Walden. And it was open clear up 2 stories, and there was a railing that went around the 2nd floor, and it opened up into that foyer. And he would hold the girls by their ankles over the edge of the railing like he was going to drop. I mean, we never heard about that at the time. But anyway, they were opposites. And then Courtney, she was always kind of the leader of the 2, even though she was a little kid. Whenever it came to like going to see Santa Claus or something, Courtney was the first one out in front. She had no fear. Boom, and everybody else would follow her. Matt always had a little bit of a shy streak in him. Kirsten, not so much, but she was still a little reluctant. Not Courtney, man. She was just off and running. She'd do whatever she wanted to do. She was always a go-getter. So 3 different kids, 3 totally different personalities. And I would like to think that growing up that I was close to each one of them in a different way. I just hope that that's what they think about. We started camping after Marilyn lost her father in 1984 to cancer. We decided that we thought it might be a good idea if we went camping, but friends had invited us to go camping in the past, but it was all tent camping, and that did not appeal to my lovely bride. So we had to go find a self-contained trailer. So we went over, and I think she made some calls before we went to see it. But Burnings over on New Haven Avenue had been in business for a long time. They dealt with Shasta and also Airstream. And so they had a trailer over there that was like a year old or something. And it seemed like it was right up our alley. So we went up and took a look at it. The price was right. So suddenly we're camping. And so we started doing that in '84. And we would primarily camp in the fall. And I think the kids all really enjoyed it a lot. And we'd go primarily to Chain Lakes. We went to Pokagon, places like that. And then spring break, sometimes we would take it. Probably the most fun we had spring break was going to Myrtle Beach a couple of times. And we would get a spot right almost on the ocean. So you could lay there in bed and listen to the surf come in. It was really cool. So we had a lot of fun doing the camping. And of course, holidays are always a big deal for us. Christmas is always a big deal. Kids have always gotten lots of presents, and of course the decorating outside and the decorating inside and all the feasting and all that stuff has always been very important for them. We had swimming pools. We had an above ground pool at our first house. Then we had an in-ground pool at our second house that was kind of a mess, and we inherited it. And then we put one in our third house. So that was always an attraction. The kids always loved that, and it would attract friends, and we kept them, we were kind of a gathering spot just because we had a basketball hoop out in the driveway and swimming hole in the backyard, and so what more could you want, right? If you're a kid. So there was that. There was a lot of togetherness, and then we had a boat for a while. It was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, I suppose. So we used to go fishing. We took it to Rice Lake up in Ontario on vacation for a week and rented a cabin up there. And then we took it up to Lake Thompson in Wisconsin, up by Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and did a week up there. And that was fun. So a lot of different things. I mean, going places, seeing things. And we would do these family trips. Some of the companies would offer trips incentive trips that were also family trips, like Dollywood and places like that. So we'd go on those. So we spent a lot of time together, just having fun, I think. Yeah. I was with this family agency. There was no future in that agency because I wasn't a blood relative. And he had a son, the owner of the agency had a son, and the son didn't really show any interest in coming into the agency. He wanted to go into the music business. And so ultimately, as things transpired, he came back to the agency. And I had told the owner when he hired me, I said, I won't be your son's employee. I just won't do that. Because there was another guy in the office who had basically subsisted. He got the crumbs off the table because he wasn't family. All that being said, as soon as I found out the kid was coming home, I started looking for something else. And I had a couple of offers from companies and another agency, and really thought that that was just going to create more problems. Same thing, just a different scene. And had this opportunity to start this agency here in Fort Wayne. And at that time, it was kind of a branch of an agency in Warsaw. It was called Indiana Insurance Associates. And so we opened an office here in town with the idea I was going to own half of it. Fine. So we went to town, and it grew. And we started on the Illinois Road, and then we moved over to State and Beacon. And I had a partner at that time who owned the other 50%. And there was a kind of a cleaning out of personnel. People just quit because they didn't like him. And so I bought him out. There wasn't much there, so it didn't amount to much. But I bought him out, took over. I changed the name to Insurance Services of Fort Wayne at that time. And I had this reluctance to use my family name on the sign. And that goes back to when we were kids, people would make fun of our last name because of the pronunciation, Hupe. Anyway, it was all in my head. So we were at Beacon and State, then we moved out of that location, moved over on Lake Avenue. Still kept the Insurance Services of Fort Wayne name. Moved out of Lake Avenue because we lost our lease there and moved over on Georgetown North Boulevard. When we did that, we not only made that move, we changed the name to Hupe Insurance Services at that time. And it's been that ever since. And then in '99, we got back from a trip and saw the house that we now occupy was for sale. And so we called our realtor, put in an offer like that day or the next day, one or the other, and bought that. And we moved into that location then in February of 2000. And we built on a couple of times, and we've gone from nothing because we started with the first policy. And now we have several thousand people that we serve. It's gone from just essentially me to, customer service person in addition to me and another customer service person. Marilyn joined in the agency as the kids started going to school. She'd come in part-time initially, and now she's pretty full-time. And so it's been this work in progress the whole time. I never dreamed in my wildest dreams that it would be as successful as it's been. But we have good relationships with our companies. We're well respected. And there again, it goes back to what I said before. If I can earn the respect of my peers, and if they can look at me as someone that's trustworthy and worthy of the partnership, that makes me feel pretty darn good. Now, I look back, and there are times when my age becomes a problem. When I'm dealing with business people now, a lot of those people are Matt's age. They aren't my age. They're Matt's age. And they want to hook up with somebody that's going to be around a while, not some old fart like me, So there have been situations where it's become an issue. And so when that happens, you suddenly have this realization of your age. And sometimes, perspective I have on things is different than perspective of the younger people have. Obviously, my experiences are different than their experiences. It comes a time, I think, when you have to say, I need to back off. This isn't forever. This ride isn't forever. I want to enjoy some of the things that I like to do and not necessarily be on that treadmill anymore. And that's not easy to change because I've worked at it for so many years, but it's time for Marilyn and I to just kind of enjoy things a little bit. And I don't know that I'll totally retire But the responsibilities are going to be turned over to Matt. It'll become Matt's agency, not my agency. I will be his employee. He's not my employee anymore. And I think that's as it should be. He's earned it. I mean, he's earned it. He's been there over 20 years. You know, it doesn't seem possible. My little kid is, in his 40s. But, he's definitely earned it. It's time for him to take over. It's time for him to be the boss. There are a lot of places out there wanting to buy agencies, and they have a lot of money. And I've been approached, but it's not about the money. It's about continuing what I've tried to build. And what I've found in many cases is when agencies are sold, the spirit or the personality of that agency changes. It's no longer what you wanted it to be. We tend to try to be a warm and fuzzy agency and let people know that we care. And too many times when an agency is sold, it's sold to a corporate, more of a corporate structured agency where people are merely policy numbers and it's strictly revenue and there's no relationship. And that's not what we're all about. That's why we keep our customers, is because we develop a relationship. And frankly, if they don't want a relationship, I don't want to insure them. And we're fortunate to be in a position where we can pick and choose who we do business with. And if you choose to do business with me and we have that relationship, I will go to the wall for you. I'll take care of you all the way. That's kind of the way it works. But that's the way I started it, and that's the way it's going to stay. Heart problems are very prevalent in my family, my dad's side of the family, let's put it that way. Because his mother died of a heart attack. His brother died of a heart attack at 55. All of his uncles died of heart attacks. My grandma had, I think, 4 brothers. All 4 brothers died of heart attacks. So it was extremely prevalent in that side of the family. And the unfortunate thing with Matt that I think has marked him to a certain extent is when I had my first heart attack, which was in '83, he was getting ready to go to first grade. And I pulled in. I had gone to an appointment, and I was having these chest pains, and I'd worn a suit. It was a warm evening, but for some reason I wore a suit. Sweating right through this suit. And I pulled in the garage, and I really physically couldn't get out of the car. And he saw me, and I told him to go get Mom and have her, call 911. And I don't think he's ever gotten over that, to be honest with you. That was so traumatic for him. He was already scared going to school. And so then Dad has this heart attack, and, that's scary. And, it really shook him up, and I don't know that he's ever really gotten over that. I feel really bad. I mean, I wish it had never happened. It was beyond my control, but I feel bad about that. I had a double bypass, and things went well, and I went through rehabilitation, and I recovered completely, and then 5 years later, in 1988, I had a second heart attack, which was kind of an offshoot of the first one, because one of the grafts that they had put in from the first one had plugged up. So this time they just did an angioplasty and just ran a wire up in there. They didn't use stents back then, so they didn't put any stent in, but they just took the wire and ran it up there and blew up the balloon, stretched the vessel, and everything was peachy keen, and I was out in just a matter of a few days, and that was the second one, yeah. I'd gone home. I'd gone out. In fact, I was working out over at Park Center and started having chest pain. So I left and went home rather than going to the hospital, which is what I should have done. I went home. And Marilyn had a bowling banquet that night, so she was getting ready to go to the bowling banquet. And I sat down on the bed up in our bedroom, and I said, I hate to tell you this, but I think I'm having chest pains. And right away she says, well, let's get in the car and let's go. And that's what we did, and sure enough, I was having a heart attack. But that time they had TPA, which was a clot-busting agent that had just come out. And they gave me a shot of that stuff, and I aborted the heart attack right away. So it was a lot easier that time. We're so fortunate and blessed because all of the grandkids are here in town. So that's a big plus. And the fact that Kirsten's kids are right here, just across the driveway is a big plus. But we see Hank and Courtney and their kids virtually every Friday night. We go out to dinner, and I get to see them, and then sometimes twice, Friday night and also Sundays. Oh, it's amazing. It really is amazing. It puts you in a different class. You're one of the elders, I guess, for the kids. But it's hard to explain when it kind of makes you feel dated to a certain extent. I think about the things that don't seem that long ago to me that most people living today don't have any memory of. The historic things that we've seen. So you kind of reflect. When you get grandkids, you kind of reflect back on the life that you've had and what you've done, and also you look forward to how much time you hope you have left, and to be a difference, make a difference to those kids. And I think, especially Marilyn, she's a wonderful grandmother. The kids, I think, feel close to us, and they're always very lovey with us and hug us and kiss us, and it means a lot. It does mean a lot. Hopefully they have a little bit of a warm spot that I've always tried to be there for them and help them and let them have fun and provide, things for them that are fun and mean something. I look back, I appreciate my especially my grandmother, Hupe, my dad's mom, much more now than I did when she was alive. You start to mature and get a different perspective, and she was just a wonderful person. And I'm hoping at some point they would look back on me and say, hey, he was a good guy. That's all I want. Well, Big Breakfast is a chance for us all to get together. And in fact, a person I know is thinking of instituting the same thing in their family, because they're kind of going different directions and they don't find an excuse to get together. And so what we do is, regardless of what's on your plate, they seem to try to make time for that one couple of hours on a Sunday morning, every other Sunday, when we all sit down together, we all have a nice meal, we all get to talk about whatever you want to talk about, we all stay close to each other. So it's like Marilyn said, we instituted it when Courtney was in college, because she was gone most of the time. So if she was going to come home, it was kind of a big deal. She never came home. So we started saying, okay, everybody come over to our house for breakfast, and I'll cook a bunch of stuff, and we'll get to see Courtney all at one time. Didn't really interfere Sunday morning, didn't really interfere with anybody's schedule for the most part. And so that's just now evolved, that as they've developed their families are growing up, that it's become important that every other Sunday to get together. They look forward to it. The kids look forward to it. And so it's really fun. I hit it pretty early on Big Breakfast Sunday morning, peeling potatoes and slicing potatoes and frying bacon and making pancakes and all that. But I love it because, I see the look on their face and the satisfaction and the fact that everybody has a good time means the world and all to me. So that's another thing. If they don't remember me for anything else, they'll remember me for Big Breakfast and dippy eggs. Well, I think something I've learned the hard way that through heart attacks and everything else is that you have to keep everything in perspective. Most of the things that seem big and big problems, you're not going to remember them a year from now. You're going to remember what you worried about. You're not going to remember anything about it. If you keep your head screwed on straight, there's no problem that you meet that can't be solved, one way or the other. You can't beat yourself up and kill yourself over something that you don't necessarily have control over. Okay, and if you do have some control, you need to figure out how to use those controls to get the problem solved. But you can't sit around and worry about it. It's like the Bible says, you can't add a second to your life by worrying. You can't do it. And so, I've always been a worrier, and I come from a long line of worriers. But something I think I've learned better in my later years is the fact that it doesn't pay. If it's something I can solve, then I'm going to solve it and move on. I'm not going to sit here and stew about it because that's not doing me any good at all. It's not doing anybody any good. It's probably one of the most moving experiences I've ever had in my life. And it goes back to, I have this heart attack. I'm 35 years old. They send me home for a month. I come back. They actually moved the surgery up because the doc was going to go on vacation. And I checked into Parkview. It was the one over on Randalia. And I'm there by myself, and they're just doing all the preliminary stuff, checking. They forgot to get me off the aspirin, so they had to do clotting tests and get me all this stuff. And this was back when you could smoke in the hospital. And the guy in the next bed had pancreatic cancer, but he was over there smoking like a chimney. And he actually even called the nurse at one point in time to come in and get a pack of cigarettes for him out of his nightstand. I'll never forget that. But anyway, I'm sitting there, and I know they're going to split me open from my sternum to my zots. They're going to stop my heart. I'm going to be on a machine. I'm dead. And how do I get through that? How do I come to grips with that? How do I not show cowardice in the face of this looming serious situation that I had? I'm a fairly young man. And for some reason, I thought of, John 14 in the Bible, and I hadn't read the Bible for a while. And in my Father's house are many mansions. It just gave me the strength that no more worry. Turned out great. Actually, the surgery was first thing in the morning, and I'm sitting there in this room with this guy smoking like a furnace. And I'm nervous, and I'm all by myself. And through religious training, I just remembered that verse. So I figured there was a Bible in the nightstand, and so I pulled it out and I found the verse. And it's hard to explain, but part of that verse says, if that wasn't true, I'd tell you. So what do you have to worry about? That was it. It's so hard to explain. But, in a lot of liturgy, they say, the peace of God which passes all understanding. And that's why I felt it was such a moving experience. And I never worried a bit after that. And in fact, I was joking with these guys when they took me in the operating room. But I couldn't have done it without that. So it was a total release. It's like, this is going to come out however it's going to come out. And if I die, I die, and I'll be in heaven. Well, I think the thing that I'm probably most proud of is the fact that I've always been an honest man. Regardless of the amount of financial success I've had, which is more than I ever expected, I've always felt that I conducted my affairs, both personally and from a business standpoint, with some ethical constraints, and also, exhibiting a good moral character. To be honest, to be someone who doesn't stoop to just change themselves to fit the situation, but stand for something. There again, I was always taught, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything. You've got to stand for something. You've got to stand up at some point in time. And so I've always tried to pride myself on telling the truth, regardless of the situation, being as honest as I can, not cheating anyone in any way or shape or form, regardless of how minor it seems, because I'm the guy that's going to have to face myself over those situations. And I would just like to be remembered as someone who was respected and honest and caring, and the kind of person that you want to be a friend with. because of the circumstances on our getting together in the first place, okay, because that was the longest shot you ever saw in your life. She calls randomly that one evening, and we get together, and suddenly, you know, a year and a half or something later, we're married. And then we weren't even sure we were going to have children, and then we have children, and then they have children. And suddenly we look at this happenstance relationship that's worked out to be a wonderful life for both of us. And now we have all of these children that are part of that. And they all carry a piece of us. And it's amazing. It's just amazing. I mean, you don't believe in fate. I think it was God's plan. I think that he's the guy that was pulling the strings and said, this is the way things should be, and it's going to turn out well for everybody. I do. I'm so proud. Love my family.
Yeah.
They're very special. So, appreciate you guys doing this.